So welcome everyone. This is the second webinar on North Atlantic right whales brought to you by the Ocean Tracking Network and the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Before we get started, I just want to say that we have people from across the country who will be joining us and taking part in this webinar, but we do want to begin by acknowledging that we're hosting this in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and that we're all treaty people. My name is Sean Brillant. I'm the Senior Conservation Biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And I gave a webinar last month on right whales, the first, I guess, in this series, I guess, that we're doing. And we wanted to organize this. Canadian Wildlife Federation and the Ocean Tracking Network wanted to organize these webinars to help inform people a bit more about what's going on for the conservation of right whales and what this story is really all about. Furthermore, since 2017, the Ocean Tracking Network has been in partnership with Big Spruce Brewing Company in Cape Breton, and they've been producing an IPA that they called Tag You're It, and they call it Conservation in a Can, and 50 cents from every can that they sell goes to support groups doing marine conservation work in Canada. And this year, they're featuring the right whale, and so the Tag You're It beer is focused on the right whale, and support from this is going to be going to organizations that are doing right whale conservation. Okay, so those are all my housekeeping checklists. Today we're going to speak with Tonya Wimmer. Tonya is joining me here. Tonya is the director of the Marine Animal Response Society, which is a non-governmental organization here in the Maritimes that deals with marine animal emergencies. Tonya is a whale biologist and a conservationist as well, and I was pleased that she was able to come and join us and meet with us here today. So, hi Tonya, thanks for being here. You seem to be muted. I wonder if someone can help unmute Tonya, or this will be a very short webinar. One thing I'll mention as we're
Tonya, unmute yourself now.
Oh, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, that's good. Sorry.
Hi, Tonya.
Hey, Sean. Sorry about that. We've
Okay.
started off in a great way to start.
This is the new world we're in. Before we get started, I just want to tell everyone, by the way, I've asked Tonya to join us today because we wanted to talk a lot about marine animal emergencies and the necropsies in particular, with the focus on right whales, and we're going to get to that. But I do want to point out that some people might be sensitive to some of these discussions. Tonya deals with a lot of dead animals and animals in distress and in very bad situations. And we're going to be showing some images of dead animals and images of necropsies and animals being cut up. So if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, then please be warned. You know, we're really trying to not be gruesome here, but it's just the reality of this situation. So, okay. So I just want to give that warning. So, hi. Welcome, Tonya.
Hey, Sean.
So let's start by talking about marine animal response in general and marine animal emergencies. And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what these are and the kinds of things that the Marine Animal Response Society deals with.
For sure. So first off, I am going to share, like Sean said, I'm going to share a few images and things like that. So we will flip a little bit back and forth. We'll try not to make it too chaotic so that people don't get dizzy, but some things are just better shown by images. So I'll start with a bit of that. Can you see that, Sean?
Yes.
And hopefully everybody else. Yeah, so very short, MARS, which is what we're sort of affectionately called, the Marine Animal Response Society. We've been around since about 1999. Anyone who's been around longer than that, there used to be an organization called the Nova Scotia Stranding Network, but it went defunct. And so when I was probably a very naive undergraduate student in Hal Whitehead's lab at Dalhousie, I picked it up, and then it has since morphed into and grown into MARS. We not only respond to incidents throughout the Maritime provinces, but we also run the toll-free hotline on behalf of not only ourselves, but also a wide range of partners, and we'll introduce you to a few of those people a little bit later. But this is the hotline for reporting dead and live distressed cetaceans, which are your whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, sharks, turtles, any other large marine animals. We've been getting sunfish lately. And so every year we get hundreds of calls to this toll-free hotline, and it really is important that trained people are available to lead the response. Mainly this is about human safety, number one, is the biggest thing, but it's also for the safe and humane treatment of the animal and doing what we can as best as possible for them, because we do deal with a number of live animals.
Mm-hmm.
The other side is that it's also about learning as much as possible that we can, especially from dead animals. These unfortunate circumstances give us quite a bit of opportunity to learn as much as possible. So then, and all of that is fundamentally important for their conservation. Mars at its bare root is a conservation organization. We do that through the on-the-ground work with the animals and our local communities, but it really is about the conservation of these species. So what I'll do is just give you a quick look at some of the incidents we deal with. And a number of people are probably very familiar with the very big events that happened, especially over the last few years. So things like entangled right whales and dead right whales have made the news quite a bit. But I think for everyone, it's also very important for them to know that it is about a lot of other things as well. Very luckily, except for the last few years, these events don't happen too often. It's more things like smaller dead species like porpoises and dolphins, other large ones like fin whales, humpbacks and whatnot. And of course, we deal with things that are sick or injured like the seals. Not all seals are in trouble. I say this with every talk I do, doesn't matter what audience. Most seals are fine, they can be out of the water, but little ones can be injured or aren't doing well. The other big thing that people may not be as aware of is that we get a lot of live, especially cetacean incidents, but also of other live species. And so things like live whales that come ashore and strand, we also get animals that go in weird and obscure places. This was the beluga that went up the river in northern New Brunswick a few years ago. They also get entrapped in various fishing structures or other structures like dams. And we also seem to have one of the hotspots in Canada for mass strandings. So this is where multiple animals actually come ashore at one time. And so for all of these incidents, it's because people in our communities let us know when they happen, or people on the water, whether they're from industry or pleasure crafts. But it really is about having trained people who are available through Mars and other partners to be able to respond so that people stay safe. These are wild animals. So this is really one of the fundamental pieces of why our organization and others exist.
Right. And I mean, obviously, when we take into account all the different whale species and pinnipeds and turtles and everything else, we've got 30 or 40 or so different types of species in the Maritimes alone. I mean, the point of this webinar really was to talk about right whales, and we want to bring people up to that, but this obviously isn't the only species that you're dealing with. And similarly, not only dead animals you deal with, eh?
For sure. And I mean, and so that's the thing, I've shown a few here like pilot whales and belugas and whatnot. But I mean, the other side of this is that, like you said, we have, almost 30 species of just whales, dolphins, and porpoises, handful of seals, so many shark species. And so, yeah, we get, we are so lucky to have that wide range because it means our waters are incredibly rich. But we do get things like the largest animal on the planet that every now and then are found dead, like this blue whale last year. And then common species like humpbacks and minke whales. The minke is actually alive on the rocks here. The minke's on the right with little white patches on its arms. And then we have really obscure species every now and then, which are phenomenal to actually get to look at. I prefer looking at them happy, healthy in the water, but we get sperm whales, and we also get beaked whales, which kind of look like a dolphin, but they're about 3, 4, 5 times the size. And so we do have this amazing diversity in our waters, and you add to that all the sharks and the turtles and everything else, and we're lucky, but it does mean that unfortunately they get into trouble. Right.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's really key here is that all of these events, and you deal with a wide range of events. You have lots of pictures of dead animals, but you deal with a lot of live animals.
Yes.
As well, I realize, and as you said, they can get entrapped or they can get entangled and so on. But all of this starts because somebody told you about it. Right. And so Mars is the official organization that receives all of anyone who finds a marine animal emergency. I call these emergencies, although sometimes it's not clear because the animal might be dead. But people have to realize if they come across an animal live or dead, it's an opportunity to report it. And you're able to get this information because someone took the time to report it, eh?
Exactly. And I mean, the key thing there too is that because we have worked together with all these partners in the Maritime provinces. So all 3 of the Maritime provinces, all the major groups who work on this stuff, we work together, and including with our federal partners as well. And so whether people are on a boat, walking a beach, or up in the air on planes, when they call in an emergency, it's most of the time coming into our hotline. And then from there, we're working with other people to figure out what to do, or handing it over to specialists. And that's the other thing too, is that I want to mention, is that we work with a huge group of people, and lots of other organizations. And these are sort of the one group, the main group of them, but there's lots of other people. Right. So anywhere from our veterinary colleagues in Prince Edward Island, the disentanglement teams that exist in the Bay of Fundy, but work all over, Hope for Wildlife, the Turtle Network, various museums, people do solitary. So we have people who are specialists in certain things and people who are dealing with sort of the big picture as well. And we're incredibly fortunate because Canada has these people. We also work with the groups in Quebec and in Newfoundland, and we can talk a bit more about those networks as well. But then we're also connected internationally to our incredible colleagues in the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. So when an incident happens, if we need help, we can get it really fast, even if it's not necessarily sitting right here.
Right. And I think this is really important. I mean, you're often commenting on these things and often talking about this, but I think what's really important, Mars is an organization on its own, but more than anything, you help coordinate this network of many other conservation groups as well, who are all contributing in different ways to doing this stuff. So you really get, you're the tip of the iceberg, and you get to see everything that's going on and get people involved in these, but it's many other groups that are involved here as well.
Oh yes, and thank goodness, because there's no way any one group could actually deal with all of these things. So we've been very fortunate to have the incredible colleagues that we have in this area. It's impressive.
And we'll talk about this a bit more, but I think it's also important to point out that you don't do this for all of Canada. You only focus on essentially the Maritimes region, and there are other networks across Canada who we've worked with as well, who do the same sort of thing that you're doing here in coordinating a network of groups, right?
Yeah, and I mean, very luckily we've been able, I mean, that's the thing is, so I'm just going to turn that off for a few minutes, but I mean, that's been the great thing, is that through all the work that we've done, and especially also, I mean, Sean, you're our national chair. CWF is the national chair for our national alliance about all these groups. And, there's not many people it's on the shoulders of across the country, but these people are very well connected. And that's probably why we've had as good of a success building it over 20 years as we have.
Yeah, a huge, big effort though, and a big effort from a lot of small groups and small numbers. So it's really impressive. So just to get a sense of that, can you give me a sense of just how many calls you guys deal with in the Maritimes region alone?
Yeah, in any given year, I mean, it does vary because obviously we can't predict when things are going to happen. But any given year, we usually have somewhere between 400 to 600 phone calls a year. Not everything is a must run out the door and immediately deal with it. We probably, of that, easily 100 or 200 are about seals. And so this is why, again, I repeat, seals can be on the beach. They're fine. They like to suntan. They have to come out to have babies. It's all fine. But that's the thing, is a lot of them we can deal with fairly easily. It's just a high part of the volume of calls. And then somewhere in them around another 100, almost 150 might be of various whale, dolphin, things like that. And then with turtles, we actually will take the information and forward it to our colleagues at the Turtle Network. And lately we've been getting more and more things like sharks and sunfish, which are a very different thing to deal with because they don't breathe air. And so time is really of the essence. But it's a wide range of types of incidents in a given year.
And when you get a call, what's the kind of thing that happens? You make an assessment quickly and you reach out?
Yes. So, I mean, that's the big thing is, I mean, first and foremost, that absolute critical first step is that people will call. They have the toll-free number, regardless of if you're able to do anything, even if you're just walking a beach or happen to be on your boat, you're heading out to fish or whatever, checking your nets, whatever it is, they've got the number. So that reporting, we can't highlight enough that is the most critical first step. We have to know. If we don't know, then we can't help. But yeah, then the whole thing is about doing a proper assessment, gathering information from people about what's going on in the surrounding area, and then trying to figure out, what can we do? Is there doing some sort of an assessment, figuring out if a team needs to go out or if we need to tell another team, another organization, work with Fisheries and Oceans. The whole process kind of goes through that.
And we've talked about this before, and we'll mention it again here. To me, this seems like such an easy way for anybody who spends time on the coast to get involved in marine conservation. I mean, knowing who to call, knowing what to do when you come across a marine animal of some sort is going to be really important. And these, you don't get this information unless someone takes the time to report that they found something, and that's
Exactly.
a very important step. That's where it all begins.
Yeah, and and that's why, even, in the very beginning, we've had this toll-free hotline since the early 2000s, and then it became the network hotline sort of mid-2000, 2007 or so, and that was probably the biggest step, was to make sure that this number is the number that is used. So it's on all materials, whether it goes to, through DFO, through our partners at Campobello, through our partners at the vets, on hotlines or on websites. It's the one number so that people don't have to be confused about who to call. It's in fishing conditions that they are told that this number exists. And we work an awful lot with local fishing communities and First Nations and other industry so that they all have that one number.
Yeah.
Which is the best way also, not only for us to have people who then, we get the information quick, but it also means all that information is coming into one place. Right. So it gives us our greatest chance of actually understanding what's going on from a holistic point of view.
And so to be clear, what I hear you saying is this number's for everybody, whether you're a fisherman or a mariner, or you're a recreational boater, or you just happen to be someone going for a walk on a beach. Anybody can call this number and report an event or an incident to you. So I think that's important. I think the other thing I want to mention is, what is an event? Seeing an animal swimming by is not necessarily something that you need to be alerted to. But and similarly, seals do come out of the water. So seeing a seal on a beach is not necessarily a reason to call an emergency hotline like yours. So there's other specific events that we're looking for, right?
Exactly. And and the thing too is, when in doubt, we'd rather you call.
That's good.
Because our people are on our hotlines are trained to sort of talk through and figure out if it's something normal or not. And again, you're right. A whale swimming by, one of our coves or our harbor isn't necessarily means to say, oh my gosh, it's an emergency. It's definitely something to be very, enjoy. This is why we're so lucky in our waters. Enjoy, but from a distance. Don't go out to them. Don't interact with them. It's actually illegal to get too close with whales now. There are ways to report just general happy, healthy whale sightings through Fisheries and Oceans Canada. But yeah, it really is more, that's why the assessment phase is so critical, and getting all that information from people, and why our hotline operators are trained in that way to figure out if it is something that needs to be responded to or not.
I think that's a good point. Call if in doubt, but give it some thought. The other thing I like to emphasize too is sometimes people come across a dead animal and think, oh, that's it. Like, the animal's dead. There's nothing to be done about it. But actually, and we're going to talk about this in a minute as well, that's also really important to report. Even if you just come across a dead porpoise on a beach, it's worth, let alone a giant, it's worth.
Most definitely. And anything, if it's a marine animal, although we occasionally get the calls of moose and deer and other fun things, which we work with our other federal agents for those. But anything, because part of this is also knowing where all the animals that die, and we are going to talk about this in a second, more about what we do with a dead animal. But it is also critical that even if it's a dead animal floating or on a beach, that also gets reported. Now, we don't do disposal per se. That is still up to the landowner or the municipalities. But if it's something that we are able to get and are interested in from a scientific point of view, we do make every effort to do that. But other than that, we also still want to document them as much as possible.
Yeah. And I imagine you're a good resource for people trying to figure out what to do if they do have an animal on their property or something.
Yes.
So that's useful. Okay. Let's move on a little bit here and talk about right whales. We've been wanting to talk about right whales. We're not going to talk about right whales too much in general. I gave a webinar that sort of talked a little bit about right whales and the situation they're facing here in Canada. But the situation is, we've had many right whales dying, and Tonya and Mars have really been on the front line of dealing with a lot of those situations. And that all started in 2017, and it certainly got a lot more busy for you, didn't it?
Yes, it certainly did. And that's the thing, is we've been dealing with, large dead whales for a long time. That's just part of the nature of where we exist on the planet and in relation to oceans. And, with some of those, like right whales, we can investigate. They're of high interest, high priority, and with others we can't, especially when they're floating. It's very hard to sometimes get the necessary support and the resources to bring another one of these other species in. Although we're working on a program to get us out to being able to check those animals out at sea. But yeah, so for right whales, just let me show you something very quickly. Right whales, as you mentioned in your previous webinar, Sean, it's, they've been protected in Canada for a long time. They're an endangered species, now critically endangered, considered internationally. And so this is the only graph I will show, I promise. But it's just to give everyone a quick idea that since the Species at Risk Act came in 2002, we've had 32 right whales that have been reported dead. Now this graph, the blue bars show you the dead animals, and then on top of that are the entangled ones, so ones that were then reported alive and swimming around. And this is just for right whales, no other species. And it's very clear to see that, yeah, the peak in our last 3 years is pretty significant. Right. But we have had deaths and entanglements since these species was protected under federal law, since 2002. And so it's a pretty glaring thing. And 32 dead whales since 2002. And of these, most of them, the 21 of them, were in the last 3 years. So, we were able to necropsy 17 of them, I think, and figured out that I think 65% had died from vessels and about almost 20% were entanglements. And that's just of the, these are animals that are reported to us.
Right.
During this time, there was 39 entangled whales at that time too, and several that were considered seriously injured. So for this very endangered species, that's not exactly the trend we want to see. We want these bars to go to zero.
Right. And this is just Canadian as well, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, that's the other thing too, is that our colleagues in the US also during this time had animals and continuing into one that actually was dead and reported only a few weeks ago, a calf, unfortunately.
Well, and we don't need to dwell on this, but certainly this graph is showing what we mentioned last time, is that especially since 2017, we've sort of had this mortality crisis of right whales that's been going on, and that's been a real challenge, and we've been finding a lot of these dead animals. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So even if we find a dead right whale, we find a dead right whale floating out there, or one that washes up on the beach, generally you're notified and you get involved. You might, in some cases, Fisheries and Oceans is a key partner in all this and contributes a lot of help. They help get these animals ashore. And then all of a sudden you've got a dead right whale to deal with. And I want to talk a bit about why that's important and what dealing with dead right whales has been doing for us.
Yeah. And I mean, so the big thing is that obviously when we have a dead animal, regardless of species in our mind, but especially for things like right whales, the idea is that we want to figure out what happened to it. That's undoubtedly the first question everyone asks is, well, what happened to it? The biggest thing is we have to look at them. So if you don't look, you won't know. And we will not have the information to be able to stop it from happening again, especially if it's a major concern. The other thing we should point out here, because I know this is also the way that you work, Sean, too, is that it isn't about blame. That's right. We want to make that abundantly clear. Like, we work with so many people from industry, government, everyone, and it's never wanting to figure out why they died because we then want to blame someone. Yeah. What it's about is figuring out where we want to focus. Where do the efforts need to focus to say, how do we stop this, and who needs to be at the table? Mm-hmm. If it's an issue with entanglement and fishing gear, you better have fishermen at the table, because they're the ones who can figure out how to fish differently or in a different way or whatnot. You also need government. You need the people who study the whales. You need the people who are working on their behalf from a conservation point of view. Right. So really, that's probably the first level, is it's not about blame, ever. It
definitely is. I mean, it's one of the things that's I think is lost on a lot of people, is that if we've got a dead whale, it's like, why are we bothering to cut this up? Is this an academic exercise? Is it a bunch of eggheads who just want to go, see what's on the inside of a whale? But that's not the case at all, actually. We have great opportunities to learn about these animals, because otherwise it's not like we can capture them and study them. We have great opportunities to study why they've died and what's going on. Yeah. And I think your point's really important. It's not about finding out who's to blame. It's figuring out what happened. What's going on, so that we can stop it from happening, especially for species that are in danger. But also, our point is we'd like to do this for many other species so that they never ever get to that stage, which is probably one of the other key things that's a little bit overlooked at times. But yeah, I mean, the whole purpose ultimately is really about cause of death. This is why we work with our incredible pathologist partners, various veterinary colleagues. And so it is about looking for cause of death, conducting an investigation, passing that information on to management, industry, whoever's making rules or doing stuff on the water, hopefully leads to changes. We saw that in spades in 2017. All those dead right whales, all those investigations led to information about why they died, and then things changed, things happened. The other thing I think that's really important that often gets overlooked too, is that we want to figure out cause of death to figure out what we need to have happen. But once measures are put in place, people change fishing activities, they change where boats go or how slow they go. You have to still keep looking at all the dead animals to make sure that what you put in place is working. Mm-hmm. If you've moved shipping lanes to stop ship strikes, we should see fewer animals killed by boats. That's right. Just the rules about how it works. So the work never stops, it keeps going, and it's so important it keeps going. Actually, that's a really good another important reason that this type of work's important, because it's one of the only ways to measure whether or not these rules that we're putting in place helps, because we're going to see fewer dead animals, and or when we do find dead animals, we should find that they're being killed for different reasons or not at all, you know. So
Exactly.
yeah, really
And I mean,
important.
and you also touched on the other side of it too, is that these are also really important investigations from a research point of view. When we go to an animal, we have, you know, there's the whole stuff about cause of death, and then we have a list of samples that people have asked us for from all over the world, whether it's baleen, parts of a stomach contents, whatever, poop. We get asked for poop, you know, ways to look at reproduction. And so that's the thing, is that we also try to make sure that these unfortunate situations are actually being used to the fullest extent as possible to understand them and also try to help protect them.
Yeah, big contributions to science globally in that case.
Globally, yeah.
Good. So let's talk a little bit about necropsies. Even at the beginning, I used the word necropsy, and I didn't mean to, because it might sound like an unusual word for some people. Probably here in the Maritimes, people have been hearing about the word necropsy for the last several years because it's come into popular use because of this right whale situation. But let's talk about what a necropsy is versus what is I don't know, whatever else you do with a dead animal on a beach, right?
Yeah, so I mean, really, there's sort of the options are sort of look at it in a very basic way, collect some cursory information, or do full necropsies, which yes, is that autopsy on another species.
Right.
And so wherever possible, where it's safe, where it's logical to do, our ideal scenario is we do a full necropsy with our wonderful veterinary colleagues there. That is our ideal scenario, whether it's a little animal that we can get to them in PEI, or whether everyone is coming to the beach, like what we do with the right whales.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because of limited funds and support, it isn't always possible, and sometimes location. We can't do that for every animal.
Right.
So we run into scenarios where all we can do at times is just to go out and try to gather some basic information, photographs, measurements, the sex of the animal, maybe some blubber, some that kind of stuff. But ideally, we would like to do necropsies. And actually, I wanted to show you sort of the difference with these, just so you can see. So with a basic investigation, it's something very simple. People go out, we take an animal into a lab, you're collecting little chunks of skin and things like that for genetics or some of these, this is what we call basic sampling. And it's nothing too invasive.
Mars knows what you need to collect in terms of
yes.
Right?
Yeah, and we have sort of a team of people and even some volunteers who actually can help us with sort of this aspect, or fisheries and oceans or other scientists
right.
Help us quite a bit with some of this aspect. Mm-hmm. Because again, we can't always do a full necropsy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
However, so this is basic. Right. This is very different than what we do for this.
Right.
So this is a dead right whale that was pulled ashore in northern New Brunswick. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is Wolverine, the first one from this year. What we do for this animal is very different, and it's also way harder. Yeah. This animal is about 55 feet long, probably weighs 40-something tons. It takes a lot more people. We can do basic sampling with 2 or 3 people. With a necropsy, we need an army of about 20, 30, 40. Some people question why you need so many people, because we will also be there for about anywhere between 10 to 15 hours to do this necropsy. So people do need a break. This is not a small animal. It's not a light animal. Right. And so it takes this level of sort of effort. But, first and foremost, it takes getting it onto shore, which usually means Coast Guard or someone bringing it from a long ways off. Then we need our hands down, our number one tool that we need on site is that excavator. Mm-hmm. And you'll see it in most of the photos because it's what's important to get an animal on a beach. The excavator companies we work with are spectacular. And there's probably so many now that are now experts in how to tow, unfortunately, a large whale on shore. Yeah. Because it takes a certain set of skills. But that's the thing is, so you go from this giant 50-foot animal, and right whales are spectacular. They're so fat and their blubber is so thick. Yep. It also means it's really hard to work on them.
We're looking at the belly here as well, right? Like that's the belly of a right whale. And
sorry. So that's the belly of the right. Yeah, I forget people may not know all the bits. So so this is the head of the whale looking at us. Right. You can see its tongue in the front and its belly and its flippers are pointing to the people. And so this is the other side of that animal. And they're absolutely stunning animals. They don't deserve to be viewed like this, but
not scrapings. That's natural markings there on its belly. And
yes, that's natural markings. And so this is part of the thing is that as soon as the animal comes ashore, people start walking around it. No one touches it. No one cuts into it. So this is the thing that I want to emphasize with necropsies, or that it really is an unbiased examination of an animal. even if there was gear on it, even like the whale we had this year or last year punctuation with a big wound, where logically everyone immediately thought of a vessel strike. That's sampled, it's looked at, but the animal is still looked at completely from the outside in, from looking and then taking layer by layer. And it's not easy. I mean, this is the Army, the tools, the excavators, all the people. We've been exceptionally blessed sadly, over the last few years to have various First Nations elders come and do blessing ceremonies, which has really helped because these teams are the same people who've been doing all of these necropsies, and it starts to get really difficult at times, both physically but especially mentally. I just want to show you, so when people ask the difference, this is punctuation, who was the largest whale we probably had done in those 2 years. And, people need 6-foot ladders to get on top of them.
Yeah.
The thing with punctuation here too, is she's actually in a 4-foot hole. We couldn't really get her onto the beach, so we had to carve a trough and drag her into it. So she actually extends further down. She was massive.
Just going to say too, I mean, one of the things about this, when I look at these things, some people might think you're just, you're carving up an animal like you'd be carving up a fish or something, but this is a scientific investigation that's led by a veterinary scientist.
Yes.
Very thorough scientific examination to determine the state of this animal and why it died, right? So it's on one hand, you go into a biology lab and, you do a little dissection of a frog or a fish or something. This is a much more detailed investigation led by a qualified.
But equally this is like a coroner. I mean, it's the same as for humans. It's these people, and on top of the one whale, that's Pierre-Yves Daou, who's been working with us for almost 20 years, recently retired, but he's one of the pathologists. Laura Bork is on the right. We also work with Megan Jones, Stefan Lair, the whole teams in both Quebec and PEI. And so I think we're actually one of the most blessed places in the world for the amount of incredible veterinary pathology, not even just veterinarians, but they're pathologists. They can do diagnostics and look at tissues. And we really are incredibly blessed that these people are here, and everyone will drop everything when this happens. So it's, but this isn't easy. And I mean, their blubber is a foot thick. So as soon as you start to open, it's heavy. It's why we need an excavator. It's why we need 40 people.
And 40 people.
And then the thing is, they do this, we all do this, and running around in a very safe, a very controlled, because the sampling is also very controlled, very exceptionally thorough manner. And by the end of it, and I think this might be the one worst gory photo, we end up with an animal that is completely laid open, gone through every layer of the animal, taking onion layers off one by one, and right down to even taking apart their head to look for any scars, wounds, anything.
Right.
It is massively important to be able to do this with the teams that we actually are able to do, and the support that we have from our government agencies to do it.
Well, and you were one of the authors on the report that was just released for all of these necropsies that occurred last year as well. Mars just released the 2019 incident report in partnership with your other partners and the vets and so on. So and it was also released in 2018 about the 2017 event. So all those details are out there, and you really do get a sense of sort of the thorough examination of cause of death. They look at biotoxins. They look at look at
diseases, plastics, everything. Yeah.
And plastics, people have asked me about this a lot. Do you end up finding plastics in these types of things as well?
Yes. I mean, we haven't really, and so it's two different layers, right? So macroplastics, where you're talking about, that includes gear that's on animals or debris that's on animals. We definitely see that on the outside. We've obviously seen that with several of our entangled whales. But we have, with other species, have found plastics in the stomach, things like remnants of plastic bags or balloons or things like that. So it is also one of those things when people even ask for some of the simplest things they can do. Don't release balloons, try not to use plastic bags, and dispose of your garbage right, recycle where you can and whatnot. So we definitely do.
People hear about it, but you're getting to see that, right? Like you see that event and find these animals.
And I must say, that's probably the biggest thing with all of these events. And it's a hard job to do, and it's why we all do the job. No one likes to do this job, but it really is to try to make that change. But it's also from that personal point of view. These are horrible events. You go to an event and you have to be determined in most of these right whales that humans have done something.
Yeah.
And it means it's also one side. I think that's a plus because it's controllable by us. We control the activities. We can control where our garbage goes, what we produce. And so we should be able to change that tide for this species and so many others. But it's horrible to walk into a situation knowing that that's probably the situation you're dealing with again and again and again.
Yeah. And these animals, you know, I do want to emphasize the ones that we've looked at in this past year or over the last 3 years. These animals are not dying because of ingestion in plastic.
No.
It is always either entanglement in ropes or having been struck by something big and fast moving.
Yeah.
And that seems.
And I mean, there have been some cases over the years where the cause of death could not be determined, and that is by no means anything to do with the efforts of the people who are on site and our veterinary colleagues. It's just sometimes that's also a reality because these animals do decompose, and right whales seem to do it much faster than everyone else because of that beautiful blubber layer. So everyone tries their hardest to come to a conclusion and figure it out, but at times we can't. And that's just sort of a reality, which is what happens.
Right. I'm going to wrap it up in a few minutes here. If people have questions, they're welcome to submit them, and we'll see if we can answer a few. So I'll go to the questions in a few minutes here. I just want to quickly wrap up. You know, this point that you just made about sort of identifying cause of death. I think the other thing I just want to emphasize to people is how complicated this really is. I mean, an animal that can be struck by a boat or something large can still survive and then kind of be getting by and then struck by another boat, or they could become entangled and now they can't dive as well, and because they're entangled they get struck by a boat. Sometimes an injury can become infected and the infection can lead to the death, and it's up to these veterinary scientists to try and come up with the cause of death. And I think sometimes people hear, oh, there's no conclusive cause of death, and it means, well, maybe it died of natural causes, but often it's the case that it's just a very convoluted thing to determine, and they just can't make any determination. Right?
And I mean, and the thing too is if the animal's not in the freshest condition. I mean, because people always ask us too that if an animal's really far gone, is it worth looking at? Always. I mean, 2017, the vets proved that that's the case. I mean, even with sometimes a fairly decomposed carcass, they can still find evidence of what may have happened or contributed to the death. And so ideally, yes, freshest animal as possible will at least give us the biggest sort of set of information and evidence to put the last minute's picture together. But by no means does that mean any animal that's really far gone shouldn't be looked at if it's possible, and if the support exists.
I think that's really important. I mean, if people have ever come across an animal on a beach, even if it's not very old, it can be in pretty bad shape. And these big animals as well can be in pretty bad shape. But I think that's really important, is that it doesn't matter. There's still some value there to be had.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. I have a few questions here. I'm just going to jump to them and we can jump back and forth. Did ask, what happens if a large animal is beached at a location that's difficult to retrieve?
In terms of a dead animal or alive, or both? Yes. So, I mean, that's why it isn't always even just that we don't necessarily even have the resources to pull an animal in a certain place. Sometimes they are we have a lot of islands. We have a lot of, even animals floating offshore. We can't get all of them to shore, even if sometimes they're fresh, which is why we're looking to developing an at-sea sort of sampling program. And even with live animals, we've unfortunately had even live animals that are stranded in places where we know, but we can't actually get the people or the resources there. Necropsies with a big whale, we need an excavator. People will be there for a week if we actually had to do it all by hand, and it would never work. So yeah, sometimes that actually is also the reality.
And I know even from 2019, there were some whales that washed up in distant places we couldn't get to. In 2017, several of them washed up on very remote parts of the Newfoundland coast, and there's no easy way to get to those things. So,
exactly.
Question someone just asked too, after this is done, what's done with the remains? Like, how do you deal with it?
Well, and it really depends. I mean, obviously with a small animal, it's a little easier to deal with, and no different than what veterinarians do with a lot of terrestrial, domestic animals. But yeah, for big whales, they're usually buried on site. That's our ideal scenario to dispose of an animal, is often that they can be buried somewhere on site. We've got a few places now around the Maritimes, which unfortunately have quite a few carcasses buried in there. Sometimes they're taken to landfills, and at other times people want the skeletons. So we've been able to support various museums to be able to have some either skeletal remains or the entire whale. If you ever get the chance to go to the New Brunswick Museum or the Royal Ontario Museum, they have some phenomenal collections that has been supported by people getting dead animals, essentially.
Yeah, that's right.
So the education lives on through some of that as well, which is
that's really cool. I'd rather see them alive, but yeah, that's very.
Me too.
Someone is asking how they can become a volunteer, and they know that there's courses. I think so. This is a really key thing. We mentioned earlier how being a part of reporting and making these reports means knowing who to call and knowing what to call about. There's also opportunities to become more trained, right?
Yes,
And get more involved too.
most definitely. And we were going to come to that. So that's great time to ask that question. Oh, hold on. I almost want to flip the screen so you don't have to see this again. So yeah, I mean, the one thing is that, people often ask sort of how they can get involved. And I mean, people's choices about what they do, how they affect the environment is top tier. But yeah, so there's several ways, sort of an immediate sense about response. And, hands down, number one is calling that toll-free hotline, the one for the Maritime provinces, to report anything you see. There are also hotlines for Quebec, BC, and Newfoundland, and you can find them under the link at the bottom there, the marineanimalresponse.ca. It takes you to a link to a Canadian Wildlife Federation site where all the information for all the networks are hubbed. The other thing, as someone rightfully just asked, is about getting involved directly. And so we do take volunteers with Mars, and you can email this email address to get more information. You can also go on our website under volunteers. And what we've actually been doing over this, we're very fortunate to have someone help us with this last half a year or so, is building up that program so that we can find ways to have people in our communities help us even more than they already so generously do. And that's anything from courses to help learn how to do basic stuff to people we have some very keen and incredible people in our communities who want to be able to do even more. And we'll have courses about how to work with us to handle live animals, refloat them using rescue pontoons that we didn't even really get to touch on, or potentially helping us with dead animals as well.
And I think one of the things I want to emphasize with this is, I think I'm pleased and I want people to volunteer, and people don't realize how important it is to do that. But the reality is, it's not like you're dealing with a dead animal every day. It's not like you're dealing with, an emergency situation every day. This is essentially an emergency service. Maybe nothing is happening for a long time, and that's difficult too. So I think people need to be prepared that if they want to start volunteering with this, it's very important that they need to do that, and they need to understand that they're becoming a part of an emergency network. So there isn't an emergency every day, but when it happens, you really do need the support of these individuals and these volunteers. So, and
I mean, we've been very fortunate that even before sort of the official volunteer program exists, I mean, outside of that, anytime, when I know this works in the other networks as well, but when something happens, if we go to a community and have to deal with an animal, often it just takes asking someone who lives there, and people will help. I mean, this is the one true lovely nature of the Maritime provinces. You and I are both Maritimers. We know this. It's, when you ask for help, someone will do it. The number of times when we've had floating whales in the Bay of Fundy, and I've had a fisherman who will send me a note saying, do you need a hand? We've got a boat, or we've got a truck, or there's a boat, borrow my four-wheeler to go down, so we're very fortunate as the part of the world we live in that this is actually also part of that generous nature of Maritimers.
Yeah. And related to this, another question came in. Someone wants to know how they can support this work. Is there ways to support financially? Is there ways to buy swag and show their support as well? The short answer is yes, of course.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's the thing is, I mean, we are a charitable organization, and so we've, and we've actually been supported in 2017. We were actually one of the recipients of the OTN's, one of their first or second batch of the Tag Your It beer. They were in Big Spruce and whatnot. We're in OTN. We're incredibly generous to say, hey, you guys look like you might need a little help this year. So that's been wonderful. But we take donations. We take, most of our work is relying on grants and foundations, but a lot of it's on people in communities who so generously offers financial support, and that is always incredibly welcomed. It'll always get used to the best of our ability for these animals. We also have people who, that may not be possible, but maybe they have a truck, and so they just let us know that if you're in this area, I have a truck, I have a boat, I have a wharf, I have a freezer. Oh my God, people who have freezers around the Maritimes are like gold.
And willing to take that animal, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they have to be willing to maybe put something in it, but never with human food. I should clarify that. Yeah. But yeah, it's even having that level of information and sort of getting that kind of information. We're hoping to develop wish lists and just have them out there so that if people are able to buy something that helps, whether it's sheets or buckets or cameras or whatever it is, then we actually are able to have that support, which is wonderful. Really
asking about the training that's involved. Can you just talk briefly about what the training, I mean, if you want to become a volunteer, if you want to move towards becoming a responder, one of these people putting your hands on dead animals, what's the training that's going to be involved?
Well, and that's a really exciting part because we're actually getting ready to launch our new training platform in the next, hopefully a few weeks to months or so, depending on how busy our responders who are doing it are going out the door. But we're in the process of actually building a program where people can sign up and get to whatever level they feel comfortable with, because it isn't for everyone to deal with a dead animal. You physically may not be able to deal with live animals, just in terms of the physical fitness side of it, or just don't want to. Because this is always first and foremost about people's safety. So we do need to make sure that that's very clear for people. But it is, our new training platform will have different levels so that people can learn about the health and safety, they learn about the species, about the organization, and then they can join in on different levels to be sort of a basic volunteer, which is learning how to report, then learning how to work with us to go and just do some initial documentation. And then from there, we actually are planning to have levels involving sort of further advanced work around how to work with us to sample animals in a more advanced way.
Right.
And also learning, we actually run the only marine mammal medic course in the country, which is teaching people how to handle live whales that are beached. And that's where we actually work with volunteers to train them how to not only lift things like dolphins using stretchers, but also how to refloat a whale using rescue pontoons, which is pretty spectacular when you learn how to do that and realize it's quite an amazing piece of equipment that very luckily came from our friends down in New Zealand.
Yeah. And, that's a good point. Like, because of the nature of being an emergency response group, you've got you're not necessarily going to be dealing with dead animals. You might be dealing with live ones. You might be dealing with very remote places. You might be unpleasant situations. It sometimes seems like animals choose to have an emergency, usually around birthdays or holidays.
Yep.
All of a sudden you've got to call and you've got to go deal with these things. So
yeah.
Well, that's a good point. There's a wide range of things.
Well, and I mean, the other reality sort of is too, like for the most of the people who work with Mars, and we are very small, we only have, one or two full-time employees if we're lucky. And then there's a half-time and part-time people who make this. So we only ever have somewhere between 2 and 4 or 5 people that help us make Mars itself run. So those volunteers are actually fundamentally critical to what we do. And even only in the last few years with some funding from DFO, we got our first response truck. So it's, but still to go from Halifax to Sydney, Northern New Brunswick, Yarmouth, it's a lot, and it adds some time to even response. So it's very nice for us to have people sort of spread around the Maritimes to be able to help us, at least with the things that are very straightforward. We would never put anyone in a circumstance where they're not prepared, obviously.
Of course, yeah. And a lot of people have been asking, are just basically saying, how can we help and what can we do, and we've been talking a bit about that. I do want to emphasize just a couple things and give you a chance to add anything else. People can donate, but people can volunteer their time and contact you. I also want to emphasize that although Mars is a maritime-based organization, we have this network of organizations, of other networks that exist in Newfoundland, in Quebec, and in BC as well. And so, what we're speaking about here is specific with Mars, but if they go visit this website, marineanimalresponse.ca, they'll see the connections, the contacts for all of these other networks, and they can reach out and support those groups because it is such an important service, right?
Exactly. And I would also add too, because people, again, this is what I love so much about our communities and whatnot, are that people are saying like, well, what can we do? What can we do? And there's the fundamental hands-on, there's financial support, there's equipment support. The other really critical one, I think, especially in this day and age, is the fact that they can engage with their government and with MPs and talk about the fact that oceans are really important, that these species are very important, that we actually have to, we have to understand them. And I think the one thing that we and our partners here and in collaboration across the country have been working toward is a truly national marine animal health surveillance and incident program, one that doesn't have bias for certain species, one that can actually enable us to get the information we need to look at the species health as a whole, the ecosystem as a whole, because in light of things like climate change and species moving around, we're getting species in weird areas, and we need to have a better handle on, well, can they sustain that? Is the population healthy? We know it isn't for right whales, but that doesn't mean every other species is doing okay. We have many other species listed under our Species at Risk Act. And so by also working with us to put these messages out and engage with the government to say these things are important for the whales themselves, but also for ourselves. These animals are so critical for so many things, including cleaning the air we breathe. Like it's so important that they are obviously still in our oceans.
They're strong.
That are just incredible. Like who wants an ocean empty? No.
Yeah, no. There's huge memories. There are things to be experience and understand. If people get to see them live, it's amazing, you know. And as you were just saying, there's more and more science coming out about how important these are. I'm going to answer one or two questions here, more questions, and then I'm going to wrap it up. But I want everyone to know that we're still capturing all of the questions, and what we'll try and do is we'll, as we did with the first webinar, we'll get around to answering all of these questions and post a follow-up video to this meeting where we will answer any questions. So if we haven't gotten to your question, please send them in anyway, and we'll answer them and post a response later. So one good question I saw that I'd like to know: how does Mars handle animals that are brought in alive and need rehabilitation? This is a difficult one.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a tricky one here in the Maritimes because we don't actually have any facilities for rehabilitation of marine mammals. Right. And so that's a bit of a tricky one. So we do have some, I mean, luckily, again, we have access to these veterinarians. We have access to veterinarians with Hope for Wildlife, that if the animals on the beaches can be treated in some way, we might be able to do that. It is obviously a very particular thing when it comes to seals, animals that are smaller that could go in places. That's something everyone is very much working toward, at least to be able to help the animals that are of a size where it's doable. We don't have big tanks and things to put larger animals like whales in, but with some of them, we can at least get them some medical treatment in the moment. And it's something that a lot of people have been discussing about rehab.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. You know, I think, you know, especially it can really only be done with the smallest cetaceans anyway, even in pinnipeds on the West Coast and pinnipeds, you know, but it's a very difficult situation. The best opportunities to find ways to make sure that they're not in these situations, but definitely very tough, and it certainly makes for tough decisions too.
Yeah. And I mean, and hands down, I think that's one of the important things you just said there too, Sean. I mean, even for right whales, whatever the other species are, it is so hard to be reactive. In the sense of sending a team out to do disentanglement, sending people out to, you know, study them after the fact, and the amount of money and all that has to go into that. Everyone involved in a lot of this stuff would prefer these animals not to even get in these situations to begin with. Right. And I think that's why it's so important. And I mean, all of us from that perspective, we would love to not do that aspect of the job, because we've reduced the risk to these animals from all these activities. And so preventing things is, that conservation point of view, is prevention is the absolute key. We want to prevent catastrophes, not react to them.
Of course. Let me just take this last question. It's interesting. It says, from New Zealand to Zanzibar, it seems demand for stranding response is unfortunately increasing, even international. Are there examples of specific techniques developed in the Maritimes being applied or replicated elsewhere, or the reverse? And this is interesting. I mean, I'll let you answer that, but, you know, whale disentanglement was essentially in Canada in the 70s by John Lean in Newfoundland. You've taken the opportunity to be trained overseas as well with other groups, and you've also trained other groups overseas as well. So I don't know, what's a glimpse into this international marine animal?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting thing, because I mean, the one thing that it really highlights is that no matter where you are in the world, you're willing to help, you're willing to educate. You know, my very first, the reason Mars even sort of came about was there was a mass stranding of pilot whales off Cape Breton. And the very first email I got from it was a woman in New Zealand who worked with Project Jonah, who were probably the world's experts on refloating whales, because they get huge events of hundreds of animals. And so that's where a lot of the original pontoons that we used to rescue these whales comes from, and then perfected and changed and modified and whatever, but through other groups like in the UK. And so we've been very fortunate that at any point in time when we ask people, well, how do we do this? They say, well, we can help. And whether it's sending protocols, sending equipment, sending people, or having us go there and do work with them, that's the nature of this work. And, you know, even things like large whales stranded on beaches, we're still having discussions as a global community about what can we do in those scenarios, because large whales on beaches, you can never pull any of these animals off by a tail, but you can't get them into rescue pontoons. We've been fiddling with that in multiple pontoons at once. So, but we do that as a collective group, locally and internationally, in both directions, to say, well, did that work for you? Or we figured this out, you know, oh, great, we'll try that next time. And that's the one wonderful nature about having such a connected community.
It's really surprising how small the international community is in some ways, even with my little experience with it, to see how well connected you and the other groups are with South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and the UK. It's quite a small.
Yeah, we have to be. I mean, in Canada alone, when you think of the people who've been doing the response stuff for almost 20 years, it's the same people 20 years later with luckily some new infusion of blood in there. But I mean, it's a small community. And I mean, that's one of the biggest things is that, you know, even in the development of our idea about this response, this national surveillance program, you know, a lot of it, the what we need to do is there. We know what we'd like to do, how we'd like to have it go. It's the human support is often very tricky to have the resources for. We've got a lot of this work on the shoulders of very few people, you know, and that's often where we also need to build the capacity and train the next generation. Right. None of us are going to be doing this when we're in our 80s.
Yeah.
Well, some might be. I know a few who might.
That some might be. I know exactly. We only have about 5 minutes left. I'm not going to answer any other questions for now, but we will get to your questions. So thank you for submitting them, and please make sure you do send them in. I just want to take the last 5 minutes to talk a bit about right whales. And we got a nice bit of right whales.
I have to end it on a happy photo every time.
So far, so good this year. No right whale deaths found so far, and we're both knocking on wood here.
You betcha.
And so that's certainly a good sign and makes it a lot easier. But it is something that I know you're on the edge of your seat waiting for as sort of the main contact for it.
Yeah. Every phone call.
It may be something people will need to look for. They may see it in the news or hear stories about a necropsy taking place, or if they do hear about the first animal, at least now is the opportunity for them to understand really what this is all about and why it's so important. So I'm glad people.
Well, and I mean, again, this is why I always I try to end discussions on a happy thing, because really when you say what it's all about, this is what it's actually all about. This is what we want to see. We want the happy, healthy animals that don't have to face the challenges that we seem to be putting in their path. You know, I mean, they have challenges about having babies and all that, and people are working on health and stress and all that stuff, but this is what it's actually about, is to keep this not just as images for future generations, but something they might actually be able to see.
That's right. And I imagine everybody, the entire network, you know, the vets you work with, the volunteers, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, you know, everybody is really pleased to see that so far this year seems to be okay.
Sean, you got to stop saying that. You're making me nervous.
Ways to go. You know, I want to emphasize that it doesn't mean that we've solved the problem. In fact, what we've already shown in the last few years is that this problem is hugely variable. Last year, we had 9 dead animals in Canada. The year before, we had none, although we had a few entanglements. And then the year that we had 12 plus a number of entanglements too. So clearly a really variable situation. I don't think we've solved the situation yet.
No.
We're certainly not out of the woods this year yet either, but so far so good. And
and I mean, that's the best that's the thing is it's a wait and see game. We don't talk about anything and results for a season until we hit like January. You know, when we know that they're all moving back down to the US, we're all like, now we might be able to talk about it. Right now we don't. But I mean, the other side of this is that, but in the interim, you know, we have dead minkies and dead humpbacks and other species that we'd like to be able to look at in more detail. But because again, it's the game, not even a game, but the reality of it is we don't want any other species to end up in the situation of this poor species, right? So,
and these to get the attention, but often there's other ones that are going on that don't get the attention as well that you're involved with, I realize. So that's really key as well. Okay, well, listen, why don't we wrap this up? I'm really glad everyone took the time to join us and learn a little bit about what this situation is, about this sort of you know, this difficult end of dealing with animals in dire situations and in distress that Tonya's dealing with, or even with dead animals. It's a crucially important part of conservation, and I'm glad you've taken the chance to get a bit more prepared and understand, so that you can see when these stories come out what they mean. And thank you very much for joining me, Tonya. I'm glad you shared your images and background on this. It's something that I don't think a lot of people get.
No, and thank you guys, and to OTN and everyone, you know, for, I mean, one, caring about right whales as much as they do, but then giving the opportunity to be able to talk to show people more about what the work entails, because the communities are equally as passionate, if not even more so at times. And our ultimate goal really is to keep them safe, but also to protect this incredible heritage we have in Canada for all these species.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. We'll end the webinar now. And Look for this webinar to be posted on various social media platforms, and we'll probably post a follow-up video answering everyone's questions. Thank you for submitting them as well. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye now. Hello again. My name's Sean Brillant. I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and if you're joining us here, this is our follow-up video to the webinar we held earlier this week with Tonya Wimmer from the Marine Animal Response Society, who joins me now. This follow-up video is intended for us to get through the questions we did not have time to answer during the webinar, and so we wanted to take the time to make sure that we addressed and tried to answer each of the questions that came in. So we're just going to go through the questions that were submitted to us and try and give you an answer. So hi, Tonya.
Hey, Sean.
Okay, pardon me. I'm going to bounce back and forth between windows here as I'm reading the questions. So here's some of the questions that are going to come in, and I'll let Tonya answer them. So one question here: how are animals transported from the site where they are found to a lab where you can perform necropsies?
Yes, so as probably can imagine, a lot of people don't necessarily like to put animals in the back of their vehicles. We generally, when we try to move an animal, we try to make sure that it's packaged up and, so that everything is contained. We're very fortunate that for ourselves, we actually have a few trailers and also a truck that we can put it in the back. But there are times that people very generously have put it into, if it's small enough, put it into a small tub and put it in the back of their car and leave all the windows down. Yeah. The most fun we actually have with that, in a sense, even though it's a very unfortunate situation, is that we will often take those animals over to the vet college where they'll do the necropsies on site. And it's always interesting to be driving down the highway with a big dolphin in the back and people looking in and kind of wondering what you've got sticking out of the various bits. So
flapping around out the back.
Yeah, pretty much.
But there's sort of an upper limit even then. I mean, you can only fit maybe
so much. Yeah. I mean, anything sort of above, for the biggest animals we've moved have been sort of small size pilot whales, but anything bigger than that, we usually are relying on either fisheries or notions or someone in the community to be able to help us with either a bigger truck, or even flatbed trucks have been used to take some very sort of precious and rare species even over.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not sure if that's been done here, but certainly in the US, I've even seen them move large whales to appropriate necropsy locations.
Yes, yeah, they did that a few times with some of the ones in a few years ago with some of the right whales that were in the Gulf. So having to put them on a very large, take them out using almost boat lifts and then put them on a very large flatbed to be able to take them to the appropriate site for necropsy.
But in many cases, it's pretty easy, especially if you've got little harbor porpoises and so on.
Yeah, the smaller ones definitely make it easier, that's for sure. You can actually physically pick them up with a few people. Yeah, although they're surprisingly much heavier than you would think because they're sheer muscle.
Yeah, all dense.
So they're deceiving, yeah.
Solid, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. How many volunteers on average are brought to a stranding site?
Yeah, so that will depend on exactly what it is we're dealing with. So for example, if in the case of something like that, where it is a small animal, we may take 3 or 4 people because again, because they're deceivingly heavy, you also want to keep people safe and make sure people aren't lifting, things that are way too heavy for 1 or 2 people. However, when we go to do something like the larger whale necropsies or deal with mass strandings, even a single stranding, we try to have, anywhere from 10 to 30 or so people, especially when you get into those big right whale the big right whale necropsies.
Yeah.
I think last year we on average had somewhere between 25 to almost 40 people to be able to deal with the actual sheer magnitude of the situation.
Right. And I have a side question. I just want to pop in just to keep you on your toes. Of course, it's going to depend on how, like, for example, with a mass stranding, it's going to depend on how big it is. There are gigantic, unfortunate mass strandings that occur in the Southern Ocean and New Zealand, like hundreds of, small cetaceans will wash up. But we've had some big ones here as well. What's the biggest? We have. Maybe? What's the biggest you've dealt with?
The biggest one we've dealt with, we had a mass stranding of pilot whales, which are anywhere between 10 to 20 something feet long, and we had about 16 of those in one event. I know in the past, before I was involved in this, there have been ones of up to 60, and we never ever really want to have to deal with one that large. Even 16 animals, you start to, even for us with 16 animals and they're all alive, you not only have a situation where you need to have a lot of people there that are maybe your volunteers who have some level of training, but you actually need members of the public. Yeah. And because you wouldn't be able to do it without having at least 4 or 5 people per animal.
Right.
And so we've done that before, where we basically just sort of bring people in, give them all the basics, make sure we have someone who's watching everyone. But it's just not even possible in some of the sheer magnitude of those cases to not have enough people.
And we've been lucky. 16 is pretty bad. And if you've got, 5 or 6 people on each whale, that's a lot of work, and then a lot of coordination for the specialists like you as well. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Occasionally we get large whale strandings as well, right? There was a sperm whale stranding. Large,
yes. We even had mass strandings of sperm whales. I mean, one December that was in northern New Brunswick, and it was like December 6th, in a spot where people really didn't even know we had sperm whales, let alone live sperm whales. And then it was December. So that was, and I mean, in some cases, especially when you get animals that big, there are decisions to be made about what you can do, or if you try something, the biggest thing is you never want to do something that's actually going to hurt the animal more, so that you put them back in the water and then suddenly they can't swim because you've done something to their spine. And so there are cases where unfortunately the animals but you basically just have to let nature take its course and keep them comfortable, which is one of the most horrible decisions to have to make, but it's also one that's never made lightly or without a lot of consultation with the vets in fisheries and oceans.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we made that point, but that's an important thing. It's not a simple matter of grabbing an animal by the tail and dragging it back to the beach. I mean, in ways that might be the same as grabbing a person by their pinky and dragging them, right? Something's gonna
or
break.
by their neck. Yeah. I mean, it's instinct for people that, they see an animal, especially if it's sort of small enough that they can, think they can maneuver it. And it looks like a perfect handle, right? You grab the tail, you pull. But like you said, you're now pulling the entire mass of an animal from one of the smallest points on their body. And their tail doesn't actually have any bones in it. So it really is just like small vertebra going to the end. And if you pull, you can actually dislocate their spine or even sever their tail. And so that's why the specialists exist and do what they do in terms of how you best handle the animal. And because no one wants to hurt them further, but people just don't understand that.
And how many on that sperm whale mass stranding, how many whales were there?
4. 4 juvenile males, because we get sort of that age group around here, and they were easily in the range of 40 to almost 50 feet long.
Yeah.
And then it was cold. So, I mean, they didn't last long. It wasn't possible to actually get those guys off the beach, and they perished pretty quickly, but they were mammoth animals. And they're amazingly beautiful animals, but that's definitely never the situation you want to see them in.
And such a crazy opportunity to see them, and such a crazy opportunity for science and everything else. These are beasts out of legends, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I've forgotten where I was.
I know, and so you got distracted.
Fish. Why might sharks and sunfish show up on beaches? Is it usually because they are injured?
Yes. So, I mean, that's quite the interesting. I mean, as our name sort of implies, it's marine animal response. And so actually I should mention the response part is very specific as well, because like we just mentioned, there are times our response is actually to help them out of their misery. So it isn't always about surviving and refloating them and putting them back in. But it's also marine animals. So we deal with anything that's pretty much big in the ocean, whales, dolphins, seals, turtles. We work with a group to be able to deal with them. And then of course, sharks and sunfish, which seem to be happening with a little more regularity. So every year we probably get several calls involving blue sharks, sometimes basking sharks, which are huge animals. And lately mola molas, so the ocean sunfish, which is not a tiny fish. It's a 6-foot diameter behemoth. And of course, when you're dealing with sunfish and sharks, they're not like whales and seals and whatnot that they can breathe when they're out of the water. With those guys, it usually is a much more, you have to be much quicker in the response. And sometimes it's just not possible because they have been out of the water too long.
Right.
Why they all of a sudden appear on beaches is a bit of a mystery. With sunfish, it seems to be like what we see with some of the whale species, that they get into places like in the back parts of the Bay of Fundy and the tide just drops out under them. So sometimes it could just be they're following food. I mean, they're eating jellyfish, so they're close to shore, and it could just be that they get stuck somewhere, or the tide, goes out without them sort of paying attention, which happens to dolphins and whales too.
Yeah. And the point you make is important. I'll reiterate that is there is a freshwater sunfish that people fish for in lakes, but this is not the same. These are ocean sunfish.
Yes.
Sometimes they're called molas. And as Tonya was saying, they look like giant discs about 6 feet around, and
with huge flippers, and they actually swim this way, and they're absolutely incredible animals. But to move one we had one here just outside of Halifax a few years ago that was alive, and with our responder Andrew Reed trying to move it, and it's not an easy feat because they're actually oriented even completely the other way, and their flippers are in the way. But yeah, they're very tricky to be able to deal with, but we're working on a system for that.
Very cool. Someone was asking about the dangers involved with necropsies on animals. I assume they're talking about like human safety considerations.
Yes, and so that's probably the other reason. Because a lot of people think, oh, it's a dead animal. There's, obviously the animal's not thrashing about. It isn't a chance it could bite you or something like that, or blow, and then there's diseases in their blow that you could contract. But there are dangers basically in every sort of aspect of the work that people do, and dead animals are no different because it is sort of that investigative process, which means, with an animal that's you can bring in and put on a bench, it's very controlled. You have only so many people, the animal's tiny. When you're dealing with something that's really big, you're often in a situation where there are people working on both sides of an animal and you cannot see each other. And there's knives. And we also use an excavator. So there's a whole lot of safety concerns. And so we always have at least one, if not two people who their job is to watch and keep track of where people are going to be climbing. And this is, in this state, these animals are slippery because you're starting to open them up. You've got a backhoe who's helping you move pieces and bones out of the way. And so we very much, with any situation, having personal protection equipment is always very important. Gloves, masks, eyeglass wear, appropriate clothing. But when we deal with large whales, you're now adding in even more knives and slippery, surfaces and stuff. So it is very dangerous, but it's also why we are exceptionally controlled about how it is done and who's involved.
And heavy things as well. Big bones, big chunks of blubber and meat. So.
Oh yeah, that's the biggest thing. Even when we deal with the right whales, that big beautiful blubber layer that they have, which makes them that nice round sort of beach bally kind of an animal. But when you actually have to open them up and you've got a foot thick of blubber coming down in an 8-foot sheet, that's again why it has to be exceptionally controlled and done by the experts.
Great. Okay, let's move along here. This is a good question. I'd seen this one come up, but I didn't think we'd have time to deal with it. So someone was asking how you prepare emotionally and mentally to respond to these events or to perform necropsies, and particularly if you bring in new folks in. That's a really good question.
It's a very, very good question, actually. And it's one of those things that I think until we really hit 2017 and then 2019, the full weight of what you're dealing with, it's, we do necropsies and whatnot throughout a year, and they're sort of spaced out. And a lot of the time it's, whether the animal, it was an accident, or they got caught somewhere and they just couldn't get out, whether they were ill. And so for many animals, it's very much the scientific process that we just do to make sure we're collecting all the information and understanding what happened to them. And not that it isn't emotional in those cases, because I've been studying whales for almost 20 years. And so anytime you see them, it's devastating to see, but then it's also absolutely fascinating from that scientific point of view for what we can learn. And especially then that contribution to science and science, research done by many people. But it is very different, for example, when we deal with not only like mass strandings where you've got live animals or even a single animal and you're hearing them, but then when we deal with necropsies of the right whales, for example, where you are now dealing with a critically endangered species, and you're seeing many and many and many that are died, and knowing that most of them are because of human activities.
Right.
So I think most people understand that that's why they die, but to actually physically have to get the initial reports right through to doing the complete necropsy, and then probably the worst thing that we have to do is then turn around and do presentations to a giant group of people who study these species and have been trying to protect them for 40 years and tell them why all these 12 animals died and then why all these 9 died. And it gets to be, it's one of those things. I think the way that we sort of prepare in the sense is that we go in and we do our job. And it's the same with the vets we work with. It's all of our volunteers, all the DFO people. It does not mean that people aren't emotionally invested or strained by that. If anything, I think we have to keep that in a different part of our brain. Yeah. For new people coming in, it depends. Sometimes it depends a little bit on who they are. We get a wonderful opportunity to have a lot of veterinary students come in. And this is not something that many veterinary students get to actually do. Yeah. And so for them to be able to see a large mammal like that, it's not a horse and it's not a cow, it's something so much bigger, is absolutely fascinating. And it is quite, while some people might think it's a bit weird, but it is quite interesting to actually see these minds that will later go out and be these amazing veterinarians get to actually experience something like that and discuss it. It's always fascinating to hear the vets discuss this. But even for all of us who've been doing this, and in the end, I think we did 12 necropsies or so over those 3 years. The first year, it got to be exceptionally weighing by the time we got to the last animal. And we didn't really feel the full weight of it until we had left the site and probably had a chance to look at the reports and put together the big reports. And that's when it starts to hit you. The other thing is these animals were known, most of them. So people knew their lives. People knew.
I was going to say is, I mean, I've seen these presentations, and when you do these presentations, even to an audience of professional whale scientists, it's a very emotional response that everyone gets, because
Oh yeah,
punctuation, which was one of the whales you talked about the other day, was a 40-year-old grandmother who was, had
8 babies,
kids and
2 grandkids. And
yeah.
and I mean, and the thing there too, and I think that was one of the difficult things, even in between both years, or that because we had this wonderful, incredible community of people who've been studying them. Anytime a whale was found, we within almost minutes would get the history of this animal. Like, here's who it is. This is, the age. This is how many babies they had had. I mean, with punctuation, it was that she had 8 children, essentially 8 calves and 2 grandbabies, and almost all of them had died or been hurt because of human activity. So like her whole line, except for a few kids, are gone. And almost all of them because of human activity. So it was interesting, even between 2017 to 2019, the emotional transition of the people involved, because it was the same core team that did all of these necropsies from Quebec and PEI and with DFO and with ourselves. And we transition a little bit between being exceptionally upset to keep hearing about a new one, and we'd be on whales and getting a report of another one, which was really hard. The second year in 2019, I think we started to get a bit angrier. I think people were starting, I mean, and not eliminating that emotional connection to these animals, but because of it, it was just getting to be, why are we doing this again? Why do we have to still be here? Why can't we solve this?
I definitely think it could take a lot of preparation and understanding for people to be able to deal with that. It is interesting. Like, even, I remember the other day we were talking about how beautiful Wolverine, or whichever whale it was, you were showing the colorations on their chin and belly. They're beautiful, right? But of course, it's also sad. You're looking at the whale. It's the same with the idea of witnessing a mass stranding of sperm whales, which is ultimately tragic and terrible. But at the same time, you get struck by the majesty and magnitude of these things, right? So,
well, I think, and for some of us who do this work, I mean, my background is a whale biologist and doing whale conservation, but I mean, there is something absolutely fascinating about being able to see these unfortunate events, but then being able to see them. I mean, it's part of the expanded the reason I fell in love with these animals, especially because if you understand, they're mammals like us, they're laid out, everything inside is laid out just like us, but they can do some pretty incredible things, dive 4 kilometers, hold their breath for 2 hours. It's phenomenal what they can do. And you can see it in the way that they're put together. And that's impressive. It's, and a heart the size of a small car.
It's amazing. I like that. Okay.
Sorry, we'll get distracted.
I know it's easy to keep talking about these. Okay. Someone asked if ropeless technology is close to being used in the Maritimes.
Well, I'm glad that they actually asked this question, because I mean, I think that's the other side is, and you'll be able to speak to this even better than I am, but it's, I mean, the idea of why we do the necropsies and why we investigate is to try to help figure out what needs to be done to protect them. And that's probably been the biggest thing out of these necropsies on right whales over the last 40 years, but especially the last 3 here are, they were being killed by being hit by vessels, and some of them died because they were entangled in fishing gear, and some were swimming around with entanglements alive. And so, I mean, that's been the whole thing, is the drive towards, well, what can we do to change that? And I know, I mean, from the work you guys do at CWF, I mean, you're working right on the ground with fishermen about ropeless technology. And so, I mean, I'd be curious to hear a little more about how that rolled out this year.
A short answer is that it's coming along, and it's not only just groups like ours that are trying to develop it. Fishing associations are developing it as well. They see it as a solution to try and allow them to fish wherever they want to fish without posing a risk to whales. So the short answer is it's coming along. There are groups that are testing it. There are tests that are going on with different types of technology, and some of it is being helped by non-governmental organizations like ours, and some of it is being driven directly by the fishing industry as well. So anyway, short answer is it's coming along for sure.
Which is fabulous, though. I mean, because that's the thing, is I think you know, there's, because you see this, and you know, we've seen this stuff for the 20 years we've both been doing work on bycatch around, you know, fishermen sort of being that villain of, you know, oh, they're caught a whale. And I've never ever met a fisherman who's trying to catch a whale. Absolutely not. And they're as upset about it as we are, but it's also their livelihood. And so that's the thing, is if there's a way to work together to figure out how to still do that and the whales still have access to their habitat, that's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, and I just realized I should backtrack a little for others who are listening in if they don't know what ropeless technology is.
Right. Sorry.
What this is this question is referring to the development of new fishing technology that eliminates the need for a buoy line. And so that sometimes it's called buoyless, sometimes it's called ropeless fishing, because what will often happen is you've got a lobster trap or a crab trap on the bottom of the ocean, and then a buoy and a piece of rope that connects to a buoy at the surface. And that piece of rope, the buoy line or end line or warp line, whatever you want to call it, is often what we figure is what's entangling whales as whales collide with it. So that's where they're trying to eliminate the need for that. And so there are different systems that allow them. Sometimes it's a bottom stowed rope, and then the buoy will be released and pull the rope to the surface, so then they can be pulled aboard. Others will be lift bag systems. Anyway, just wanted to give some background on what that ropeless technology was.
Well, and the wonderful thing, like you said, Sean, is that there's so many Canadian fishermen fishing associations who are testing it, who are driving that technology so that it can actually become readily available and usable across fleets, which is phenomenal. They're on the front lines of conservation from that perspective for right whales.
No, everyone is trying to find a way to solve this problem.
Yeah.
Okay, a few more questions. Someone asked if there is research going on around noise pollution and cetacean strandings in Nova Scotia.
Yes. So, I mean, that's another, I mean, not often we don't talk that much about that threat. And I think the big thing is for all whales, not just right whales, but all whales, there are a number of things that can harm them. And we've talked about entanglements and we've talked about vessel strikes, which are probably the most direct. It actually physically grabs them, hurts them in some way. But of course, there are a number of other things like chemicals in our ocean, plastic that's just floating around and being ingested or being caught up on them. And then noise is also another one, in the sense that these environments are increasingly getting noisier and noisier from the activities, mostly from us, a lot of vessels and things, from commercial stuff, from recreational. And so that's been another question, is around, well, how does that impact, especially whales, because their primary sense, like ours is vision for the most part, theirs is sound, using sounds kind of like bats to be able to figure out where they are, where their babies are, where the food is, to move around. And so adding in extra layers of noise makes it cloudy. Essentially, it's like being in a noisy hall. And if you want to talk to someone on the other side of the room, it's fine if no one else is there or no one's making sound. As soon as a party's going on, you can't hear them anymore. You can't talk to them. And so there's been a lot of, because we have a lot of activity on this coast, and we have a lot of oil and gas activity, a lot of fishing, there's a lot of recreational stuff going on. It's been in people's minds for a long time. And it's one of those things, it's very tricky to deal with, let's say, a dead animal and figure out if noise was the issue, because you really have to get to the animal really soon after it's died. It has to be fairly fresh to be able to still see the signs of some of those impacts. However, there's other work that's actually going on with live whales, which is looking at potential impacts from noise by basically monitoring their health, looking at how stressed they are, looking at, you know, people going around collecting the blow from some of these whales just swimming around and seeing if they are seemingly increasingly stressed. There was a study done a number of years ago, which sadly followed the events of 9/11, and people happened to have been monitoring right whales and the hormones from them, and saw that they seemingly became less stressed right after. And a lot of that was anticipated to be because there were very few boats and there was a lot less shipping at that point. People have asked the same question this year because of the pandemic. Obviously, a lot of other activities have slowed down or stopped, or we don't have cruise ships. And there are a lot of people who are already monitoring the noise levels and want to monitor the animals to see if we're seeing reduced stress, which, for the reasons why we care about stress, is because if you think about yourself, if you get stressed, it makes it much harder to do anything. And for whales, especially right whales, it seems to be related to how well they can have babies, which is hugely important for a very small critically endangered species. We need them to be able to do what they do, and we shouldn't be adding stress to that.
Yeah, good. Okay, someone else was asking about the use of remote sensing technology in response efforts. You want to talk a bit about how you use remote sensing. And in this case, you know, we are taking this, I think, to mean the different technology that exists that could be detect or develop a response for a marine animal emergency of some sort.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's the thing with, there's a lot of technology that actually exists in terms of either studying whales that are happy, healthy, and live, or in the realm of the response and whatnot that we do. I mean, over the years, obviously the addition of technology, and especially when making it more readily available, has increased our ability to do a number of things. Things like drones actually allow us to be able to search beaches when you need to deal with an animal here, but say it's a pilot whale and you know they normally strand in a group. Well, you either have to have someone walk down an entire beach, or you can now send drones.
Right.
People have been talking about the use of drones with entangled whales from a perspective of, with a whale that's entangled, you often only have one or two approaches to get in there, see what's going on, and then try to get the gear off. But if you can fly a drone over, you might be able to get a much better picture so that you can go in as prepared as possible for what you need to do and not disturb the animal.
Right.
We recently actually just received, we're an ambassador for a company called Deep Trekker, which has big like underwater ROVs, so remotely operated vehicles. And we became an ambassador with them because we wanted to see about the use of these ROVs to help us examine dead floating whales, which we very often, for most species other than a right whale, we don't get them brought ashore. There's no support to do that. And so we've been looking at, well, how can we use drones and other technology to help us investigate them, even if it's at sea, as much as we possibly can. The technology has actually expanded the way in which we can even visualize what's going on, and also to help us, you know, better study these animals, or, you know, save the legs of some poor volunteers who are going to have to wander kilometers looking for other animals.
Right. I think it has made a big difference. I even recall last year, you know, the perspective when you're trying to look at a whale that's in distress or entangled from a boat, and you're looking over at this animal that's partly submerged, you can't really see what's going on. And I've heard even from the aerial drones from the last couple of years, it's provided a lot of surprising insights when you start looking at the problem from above, and you're like, oh, there's two whales there, or
it's even more complex, or there's a trap that you didn't know was there. And I mean, and the biggest thing too is, I mean, the added benefit is not only it'll help them figure out how to deal with it for the animal, but it's mainly about keeping the people safe, especially for things like disentanglement. It's so that they are as prepared as possible going in. And these extremely well-trained experts that we have, very luckily in Canada, you know, they have the best information going in as possible.
I want to mention as well, because it's a common question, a lot of people ask about the opportunity of sending drones in to deal with the disentanglement or to help an animal.
Yeah.
This technology is not at that point just yet. This is far too complicated of an operation for these.
Yeah, and people have talked about that with ROVs as well. Like, couldn't they just have, you know, cutters on them and things like that? And I mean, I think, you know, you can see why that would be the thought, especially because I mean, we want to be in a world where these people, and even ourselves doing necropsies, we're all out of a job. We don't have to do it from that perspective anymore. And I know the disentanglement folks would share that sentiment as well. But I mean, you know, the technology isn't quite there to have something remotely go in, especially not for something up close to the animal. These are also animals that are swimming. They're probably, in the most part, you know, sometimes animals that are upset, and you need to be very nimble. And the animal itself moves a lot sometimes while this is happening. So it is about trying to get in and make the right cuts, but you may not actually have good access with an ROV. But maybe, hopefully in the future there will be. Hopefully in the future we won't have to worry about it, because there won't be any entangled whales.
Right, even better. Someone had sent in a question saying that they had a harbor porpoise skeleton, and they're wondering what they can do in terms of donating it, and how to go about doing that. Do you want to?
Yeah, so, well, and we get this question quite a lot, because I mean, it's one of those things that if, you know, people are beach going and they find a bone on the beach, they're often, you know, they take it home, or it has, you know, been inherited down through the family line, kind of a thing, that there's this literally a porpoise in the attic or something. And it's wonderful in the thought that if people do have those, the thought of, you know, how can they share it? Who can they provide it to? And I mean, museums and other sort of academic institutions often will take bones. I mean, people, you know, like in groups like at the New Brunswick Museum, for example, the Nova Scotia Museum, you know, the New Brunswick Museum has one of the largest whale parts and bits and awesome collection, you know, east of Ontario, and it's phenomenal. And so even there's ways to sort of donate it back to some of those academic institutions.
Right. And they make a big difference in that situation, because although they've got hundreds of whale skeletons there, they're not just collecting dust, they get used for research as well. And
oh, yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's one, I mean, the real gem of being able to archive this information is that, you know, years later, and we've seen it years later, people go to museums all over the world and are doing, you know, getting little bone cores to do genetics on beaked whales that we've never understood before. So it's an invaluable collections.
This is it's a very helpful thing to be able to donate to these museums, I think. The other thing I just want to mention is occasionally someone is looking for a display, like someone would want an institution or something might want to put up a display or something. Those are more difficult to find. And my feeling is probably organizations like yours, network coordinating organizations like yours would probably be the best place to contact if someone had a skeleton and was wondering what to do with it. Because then at least you would know who to best send it to. So I might best as an answer that you and similar organizations to you across the country be the ones that people contact.
For sure, that people can contact, for sure. And I mean, even when we've dealt with necropsies, you know, we very often have people asking us about, can they get specimens or whole skeletons for different displays? Right. I mean, when we did the right whales in 2017, there's one skeleton that went to the Royal Ontario Museum, and there's another one that hopefully will be hanging at the Gulf Science Center when it's finished in Moncton for DFO themselves. So, I mean, and the thing is, and these are in themselves, the education value of even just being able to see a skeleton is, it dwarfs you. It makes you feel very tiny.
Okay. Okay, I think there's a few more questions, but they're all of the same thing. Most of them are saying how glad I am to see this work is happening here. They're pleased to see that this kind of work is being done. Many people are expressing that they have experience as veterinary technicians or working in vets and aquariums and would be interested to know if they can get involved and how they can help. These are certainly the kind of people you probably could use very much, eh?
Oh, yes. I mean, and that's the thing is that, as I mentioned the other day, I mean, we do take volunteers. And so anyone who is interested, we would encourage them to contact our volunteer coordinator, and you can go on our website under the volunteer tab and it'll give you information on how to do that. I mean, we take volunteers from every walk of life, with an exception of not very young people, because obviously we need to keep everyone safe. But yeah, I mean, anyone in our communities, because I mean, number one, like we said the other day, is sort of there's those 3 tiers of how people can get involved. And the first one is just having the number and knowing it for when if you happen to see anything from the air, on land, on the water. And you know, the second thing is volunteering. If they want to be able to help, and if they don't have to have veterinary be a technician, they don't have to be, you know, a PhD in whales. It's anybody can actually help, although we will take everybody. Yes. You know, having vets and vet techs is we're very, very fortunate for the number that are here or have retired here. And so people can also sign up to be a volunteer, or again, like we said, you know, letting us know if they maybe have resources in the community. You know, people who own excavation companies are very lovely, wonderful people. And we've been very fortunate to work with many. That's and right. They let us come back, which is always very nice. Yeah. And then, of course, the third level is the people engaging with the government and engaging with their MPs and talking about oceans and commenting on things like the action plan that is up for public comment right now. But yes, most definitely, if people want to volunteer, they just have to let us know.
Especially if they've got that experience dealing with large animals or large animal bodies. Those are very
or don't mind, even if they don't, but don't mind, you know, smell and getting involved and helping us in any way. Yeah. So and the thing is, we never make anyone do something they're not comfortable with. If you really don't want to deal with smelly dead things, you don't.
Yeah. And
it's just something worthwhile put out there.
And you provide the training that's necessary. You're not asking for anyone to do anything they're not trained to do as well.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And this would go, I think, for you who sort of deal with the maritime-based volunteers. Once again, people can go and check out the networks in Quebec and Newfoundland and BC and do the same sort of things and contact the network coordinators who know and can identify where there's opportunities for people to get involved. So that's very.
I mean, I think that's the one big thing is, I mean, it's across the whole country. I mean, Canada is very fortunate. We have this amazingly long coastline, but when you only have a handful of people who run response networks, it's an amazingly long coastline. So having people in our coastal communities who can at least even go out and do the first peek and say, yeah, that actually is a whale on the beach, or no, that actually is a moose, or it's a rock, or it's something not even animal. You know, it makes a huge difference in, you know, the Maritimes are kind of small, but you picture Newfoundland, BC, Quebec, a lot of coastline.
In the Maritimes, and I know you deal with it as well, we're both based here in Halifax, and then you get a call for a stranding of a sperm whale in northern New Brunswick. Well, there's a 6-hour drive just to get there and check it out. I know that in Newfoundland deal with even larger drives, and so
Oh, yeah.
crucially important for sure.
Yeah, volunteers are incredible.
The last thing, several people had written in expressing appreciation and enthusiasm for this, and they were wondering if there's funding to hire more people in these areas, and others had been asking how they can support this work as well. And we talked a little bit about this, but I thought we would just conclude here talking and reminding people about that. These are nonprofit charitable organizations. You're a charitable organization. There is some support that these groups are receiving from the Government of Canada, but it is far from sufficient for developing what we need to do here. So there is always opportunities for support. If people want to make donations, they can contact you or the other networks or the other NGOs in the different provinces, depending on where they are, and provide donations that way. And, getting back to the point that you made, sometimes it's not always even donations that are necessary, cash donations that are necessary, equipment and opportunities are big helps as well. So I just want
most definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and information about how to support Mars is on our website, and I know it is on the networks for the other groups as well. And I mean, that's we started this in 1999 as the Marine Animal Response Society. And I mean, I was an undergrad student in Hal Whitehead's lab at Dalhousie studying whales. And it starts with just very bare bones and an awful lot of people who are very keen. We've been very fortunate to be able to grow it to at least a few more people than just me and one other person. We have now 3 other people who are part-time, but it takes a lot. And the scale of what is done is pretty phenomenal, but it is only possible because we have the support from people in our communities, either physically support on beaches or because they donate. And it's exceptionally encouraging to us, and it has been over the years. As at times this has not always been sort of the thing that has been supported by our federal government. We've been very fortunate the last few years that there has been a lot more interest and a lot more support. Right. It does only go a certain ways. But that's where we've been very fortunate to have people in our communities who, even in a moment where we know we need to look at something, and the number of times now that I will get a message from a local fisherman who says, do you need to get out there and see that whale? I have a boat. Right. And I mean, that just shows the power of our communities and the fact that people are interested in these events and how much they're willing to help each other. And I think that speaks volumes for what we're actually able to accomplish.
Yeah. So that's important. I do want people to remember that.
Yeah.
Let me take a quick look. Yep, that's all my notes. So that's all the questions, all the other questions that we've had. In fact, probably more than the questions we had, since I like asking questions too. So yeah, well, thank you, Tonya, for coming on again and answering these questions and having a conversation with us about response in the first place. It's something that really grabs everyone's attention, and obviously we had such great reaction from the questions and listeners that people are really enthused by what you're doing as well.
Yeah, no, and we really appreciate the opportunity. I mean, both to you and OTN, and also to Big Spruce for, the endeavors of the Tag Your It, beer, which is fabulous. And like I said, we were one of the recipients in one of the early years during some of the hardest of our times. And that in itself is huge, that there's just that support and the room to have these kinds of talks and platforms so that people can learn more about what's going on. Yeah. And especially how they can help is great.
And everyone can keep paying attention because the story's still going on for this year. And at least now, that's why I like having these conversations. People, I think, are a bit more equipped to understand what a necropsy might be going on. And they can
exactly
this year and the years to come, because it's going to be a long haul for us to help these whales out. So Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll talk to you again soon.
Excellent. Thank you very much.